Okay. Hi guys. So welcome to Web Dev Club, and today we're just gonna have our third meeting. We're gonna do a short intro on JavaScript, and let's get started.
All right, so today we're just gonna, as Keisha said, gonna go over some very basic JavaScript things such as variables, conditionals, loops, functions, and scope. And at the very end, we're gonna have a little code along so you can apply everything you learned today. So if you guys remember the analogy we made in the first meeting, I believe, HTML is like the body of the person, CSS is like the style and the clothes they wear, JavaScript is like the brain. And what that means is JavaScript is capable of interacting with user input and making your HTML page a lot more interactive and dynamic. What makes it different from HTML and CSS is that it's an object-oriented language, which basically means that it's able to classify certain behaviors by using objects and classes. We can go over that in more depth a little later. But also keep in mind that it's not the same thing as Java. So let's start by talking about variables. You've undoubtedly encountered them in math and science, and it's kind of a similar concept in programming as well. They're basically containers that store values. The only difference, I guess, in programming is that you can change the value of a variable after you initialize it. So for example, as you can see in the example, we have a variable name. We set it to Bob, and then later in the program, it's legal to change it to a different value. Similarly, there's something called a constant, but the only difference is that once you declare what the value of a constant is, you cannot change it later in the program. Some common constants you might want to use is, for example, for pi. As you can see in the example, once you declare it to a certain value, you cannot change it again. Also, variables and constants can have different data types. You're not only limited to numerical values as you would be math. You can have strings, which are basically just, I guess, sets of characters, such as letters, numbers. There's something called a Boolean, which we'll go into more depth later, and other types such as ints, floats, and as such. So let's talk about conditionals. As I mentioned before, there's something called a Boolean, and that's basically, it has two possible options, true or false. And these variables are especially useful in conditionals, which check whether or not a certain condition is true. And you can use condition something called an if-else statement. And the way these work is you can say, if a certain condition is true, execute this certain line of code. If something else is true, then execute this code. And if nothing is true, else execute this last statement. There's also something called the logical operator. There's three ones that I feel like you should be aware of, and, or, and not. They're kind of, I guess, if you have two conditions with an and logical operator, both of them need to be true. With an or logical operator, at least one of them has to be true. And with a not operator, if you put a condition down, it's just going to negate it. You can also use the greater, equal, less than equal. And then the last one there is a double equal sign, which if you notice for the variable name, or just declaring variables, you have a single equal sign. And what that means is you're initializing the variable, you're assigning a value to it. The difference with the double equal sign is that it literally just means equals or is the same thing as. So if you look in the if statement, it says if the name is double equal sign Bob, that basically means if the name is the same thing as Bob. Also, if you look on the very bottom, on the bottom of the example, it says var junior false, so that's a Boolean. If you have a Boolean, you could just stick it directly into the if statement. You don't need to use like an expression like is junior is equal to false, because that's already a Boolean. It could just evaluate that and check whether or not to execute the statement. Next, we'll talk about loops. These are especially useful if you want to repeat code without actually rewriting it. So there's two main ones you should know, for loops and while loops. And the main difference is that in a for loop, you would, I guess, specify how many times you want to iterate, whereas in a while loop, it iterates until a certain condition is met. The only thing to be careful with while loops is that if you set a certain condition, you need to make sure to update the variable that plays a part in the condition, because if you don't update it and the condition always stays true, you'll have an infinite loop, which is not good. In the bottom, you can see the format you'd use for these types of, the while is kind of self-explanatory. You have a condition, you check if it's true, and execute it so long as it's true. For a statement, it looks a little more complicated. There's 3 different parts that you want to sort of consider. For the first statement, the for loop is basically the initialization of the variable. So if you have, say, like a variable I, you would declare it here. For statement 2, this is checking the condition. So it's the same thing as in the while loop. This is basically statement 2 in the for loop. In statement 3, you are incrementing the variable that you use in the condition. So it's basically taking care of the problem that you could potentially encounter while loop. And here are just some examples of how you could use these types of loops. So for the one, it's a for loop. You have some variable I, some variable max, which is set to 15. If you look at the for loop, we initialize I, or we assign I to the value 1. And our condition is to execute the loop as long as I is less than or equal to the value of max. This final part is the incrementation. This notation I++ is the same thing as saying I is equal to I plus 1, which is basically just adding 1 to the value of I. And what this for loop would do is just print out this statement into the console. This statement will, whatever max is, 15 times. And if you look at the for loop, you have 1, max is less than or equal to 15. So the for loop is going to execute 15 times and print the statement 15 times. In the second example, you have a while loop. You have some kind of value y set to 1. And your condition in the while loop is to execute the loop so long as y is less than 10. As long as it's true, you're going to print out y is equal to some value of y. And this notation is called, I believe, concatenation, where you can combine. This isn't true for all programming languages, so be wary of this, but you can concatenate strings with variables of different data. And whatever value of y, what this loop does is it takes whatever value of y it is, plugs it in here, sets, substitutes it, prints it out, and make sure to increment at the very end so your while loop actually quits at some point.
All right, so I'm just gonna go through functions now. So basically what a function is, it's very simply, it's just like a piece of code which you can call that code with a single line. Even if it's like 100 lines of code, you can call to that function and execute all of the lines in that code in just one single line. And that makes it extremely useful for if we want to do some complex calculations, and instead of writing it every time, we can make our code dynamic by using functions and taking in like values in order to produce in order to do those calculations many times. So just in terms of syntax, all you need is the keyword function. And function, it is a keyword, so make sure that you don't name any of your variables or any functions with the name function. Otherwise, you'll get an error. Then you have the name of the function, and you have parentheses. I'll talk about what those parentheses are used for on the next slide. And so you have these curly braces, and inside of the curly braces, you have all of your code. So here, all I'm doing is I'm just running a simple statement console.log. If you don't know, this is a pretty simple function. All it does is it prints on the console whatever is inside of the function. So in this case, it'll just print hello web dev. So this is a pretty important point that functions are only executed when invoked. So in this case, the function will not do anything. So the reason it's not doing anything is because it hasn't been invoked. And what this means is essentially we need to explicitly tell JavaScript that we want to run this function, or we need to explicitly tell JavaScript when to run this function. So if we add this line, say hello, and make sure that you have these brackets, then you'll see that we can now run this code and it will print out hello web dev to the console. So again, when you're invoking the function, you just call the function name and you use the brackets. Again, you may also need to use parameters. Parameters are also really important because let's say if you want to do some function where it's dynamic, where you're doing the same function over and over again. However, maybe you're using different numbers each time to do that calculation, right? If it's an addition calculation, or if it's a much more complex calculation, it would make sense to make a function out of it and take in parameters. This then allows us to essentially, in one line, we can run this code just by saying find sum of 2, 3, which will give 5, and then we log it to the console and this returns 5. So if you don't know, if you have never learned JavaScript or Java before, this may be new to you. We use a return statement in a function to end our code. So when a function is ended, when a return statement is reached, or if it just reaches the end of the function and there's no lines underneath it. And that's when the function would stop executing. And what the return statement does is it essentially just gives a value back to the caller. So in this case, the caller is this console.log function. So it gives the value of 5 back to the console.log function. And then the console.log function does performs its function and prints out 5 to the console. So this is also pretty useful as now you can do things. Okay, so this is just another example. You can get 88 by just dynamically, you can just plug in whatever parameters you need and you can easily get 88. But so a good way where you can kind of see what the return function does is, here you can see that this is returned itself as an integer. Find sum of 100, 74 will give us 174, and it's returned as an integer. So what we can do is we can perform functions on that value. So we get the value here as 174, and we can subtract 10, and we'd see that the console would log 164 instead of 174. Okay, and then there's also another way we can write functions, which is we can write functions recursively, which recursion is essentially another way which we can do iterations. If we want to run a code like n times, we can use recursion to run it. However, recursion is a little bit more tricky as it does involve essentially calling like a function. Inside of the function, we will call the function again. So you can see here, we have a function named count, and inside of count, we're running count again. And much like a while loop, we're essentially just iterating this function until some condition is met. So in this case, you need to be very careful with recursion, as you do need to make sure that you're doing two things. One thing is that you need to have a base case or a terminating case. At some point, you have to make sure that your recursion stack will stop, and otherwise you can get like a you'll get a maximum stack error, which is essentially the recursion equivalent of an infinite loop. So you do need to have a terminating case, and then additionally you need to make sure that you're changing the value that you pass in. So in this case, we have num, which when I invoke it, it's 5. And you can see that if 5 is less than 1, we'll return, but this is false. So we'll just log 5 to the console, and we'll then run count of 4. And you can see that this pattern continues, and it continues and continues until we get to we'll get to 1. And you'll see that if 1 is less than 1, this is false. So it'll still go into the this function. But once we get to 0, count of 0, it will see that 0 is less than 1, and it'll return the function. And you can see that it prints out 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. One thing that you want to be careful about, though, is when you change the parameter, you want to make sure that the parameter is going towards the terminating case rather than away from the terminating case. Like if I put num, if I essentially just ran count of num plus 1, it would give me an error because I'm never getting to, I'll never get to 0. I'll instead go from 5 to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and I'll keep going higher and higher until I hit the maximum recursion stack limit. Whoops, okay. Okay, so this is just a pretty simple example of recursion that Google has, where if you search up recursion on Google, you'll even if you search it up with the correct spelling, it'll say, did you mean recursion? And if you click this, it brings you back to the same page. So you can kind of see that this is essentially recursing on the same function, where pressing on this button calls the same. You can think of it as like pressing on this button calls the same like HTML page. So I guess you can think of it as kind of like a recursive function, a basic example. Okay. We also additionally, an important thing to talk about is the scope of a variable. So scope is essentially just the visibility of a variable, and it tells us where in our code can we use specific variables. So in this case, you can see that we are defining I is equal to 1 inside of the for loop. We don't have any statements before saying var I equals to 1. We're not initializing or declaring the variables outside of the for loop, only inside of the for loop. So that means that this I will only be visible inside of this for loop. Once we go outside here, we can't print out to the console, we cannot print out I. And additionally, you'll see that if we have two loops, both using the same variable I, we will not get any error between these two loops. And the reason is just because the visibility of this I is only within this for loop, and the visibility of this I is only within this for loop. Yeah, so outside of this for loop, if we tried to print I, we'd get an error here. Yeah, so that's just a basic example of scope. Okay, now we're gonna do just a quick kind of like a code long session where we're just gonna make a game where you input a number and the computer will try to guess the number. So you guys can open up REPL, and I guess if you want, you can also take a look. We have the code posted on GitHub, but I'm just going to walk through it right now as well. So you just want to make a new REPL, and I'm just going to keep the call it. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, make sure that you select HTML, CSS, JavaScript as the language. Yeah, so REPL will essentially give you this boilerplate kind of document where we can get started coding with coding. I'm just gonna add like a tag here just so the screen isn't blank. However, all of our code will pretty much be done within the JavaScript today. And yeah, okay. So I just made a header tag here that just writes a number guesser. And we're going to write this as a function now. Okay, so we can create a function, and I'm just going to call it guess number. And you want to make sure that you have the right syntax. So first, we need to take in a number. We need the user to take in a number. For now, why don't we just, we'll worry about that at the end, and we'll just set the number to a set value. And at the end, we'll come back and make sure that it allows the user to enter a value. And now we're just gonna try to guess this number. So in order to guess this number, we'd have to keep going and iterate through, essentially making a random number guess every time that every time we iterate. So I guess you can just set the guess. Okay, for the purpose of this, I'm just gonna make it has to be a number between 1 and 5 inclusive. And I'm going to define a variable guess, which is just going to hold the computer's guess. And for now, I'm just going to define it as 0, something that the computer will never guess, because we know that the number has to be between 1 and 5 inclusive. But the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to make this my while statement. I'm going to make the conditional that the computer's guess should not be equal to my number, right? So in order to do that, we do need some guess defined before. So I'm just going to use that. And we want to make the guess into a random number. So there's, if you can also just search it up, but I know the function maths.random, this will give you a random number between 0 and 1 as a double, I believe. So because it's between 0 and 1, and if we multiply it by 5, multiply it by 5, that gives us between 0 and 5. And the 5 is non-inclusive because maths.random gives a number between 0 and 1 non-inclusive. And then if we add 1, now we're between 1 and 6, except the 6 is not inclusive. So it'll be like, you can think of it as like between 1 and 5.999. And then I'm just going to bound this to an integer by just using math.floor. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's just the floor function. I'm sure you've used it in math once or twice before. It just takes the largest integer lower than the value passed in. Okay, so every time that the computer makes a guess, all I'm going to do is just console.log, and I'm just going to log out the guess. And let's just see what's happening. Again, remember I have my number just defined as 3. So let's take a quick look. Oh, I'm not calling my function. Yep, so my function here, you can see that although I'm defining a function, I'm not invoking it. So nothing is really ran. Nothing is being run. So if I just call guess number, now this should work. Yeah, so it took like many tries, but it finally got 3. And you can see that if I change this number to 2, we'd get something similar. Looks like this time it only took 2 tries. And we could continue that. In order to make it better, I'm just going to use a prompt. Prompt is a Java function which allows you to take user input pretty easily. So I'm just going to run this, choose an integer between 1 and 5, and it should come up as a pop-up. And I can just run 2, and it stores the value as 2. If I do 4, it stores the value as 4. And you can see, so this works out fine. However, you'll realize that if I put letters, it doesn't really stop me from putting letters. It just allows me to do it. And it might, yeah, it stops. It'll just, yeah, your code just won't work if you take in numbers. So we'll come back to that. This is something we need to fix though. So I'm just gonna put a comment here. Whoops. Okay. So, I may have to reload this. Sorry about that. All right. Okay. Yeah, so I'm just gonna put a comment here and we'll come back to that later. Just to make it look neater, I may want to, it's kind of hard here if we have to like manually count the number of tries and everything like that. It might be best just to make the computer count the number of tries and print that out. So here we can set a variable num tries, and I'm just going to set that equal to 0 for now. And this is just, that means every time that the computer makes a guess, I should increment num tries by 1. So I'll just do that. So plus plus is a special kind of operator, which essentially just tells the computer add 1 to num tries. So now if I were to like log to the console num tries, you'll see that it'll add 1 every time, and it'll add 1 to num tries every time. And okay. So now if we run this, you'll see I put in 3, took a lot of tries, but you can see that it prints out the try every time and it increments by 1 every time. So yeah, so just this is a special kind of operator. Plus plus just adds 1 to num tries. And you can also do minus minus, which just subtracts 1. This is a pretty cool operator. So now we have a pretty good, honestly, we have a pretty good like number guessing game already. There are some ways that you can improve this. And as we're wrapping up, I'm going to sort of challenge you to try to improve it in a few ways. One thing is with the number, right? You're going to want to try to implement some system so that you're not taking in any letters. And if the user does input a letter, you prompt them again to just enter in another number, try again, and you keep doing that. So just an idea, you know, if you're thinking, right, you're probably thinking, right, we have to do this like n times until some condition is met, where the condition is my number is a number between 1 and 5. So since you're doing this multiple times, asking for a prompt until you get that result, you may want to consider using a while loop. And that, I guess, is a challenge for you to try to do. Then, yeah, so that would be one thing. And then another thing you may realize is that here we're guessing the same number multiple times, right? And that is inefficient because in reality, it should only take us at most 5 tries every time. It shouldn't be taking us like 10 or 20 tries. So yeah, so you can try to implement that. You can maybe use an array to store the past guesses. Array is just a list of objects, and you can read about that just with a quick Google search. But all right, I think we're pretty close to done for today. Let me know if you have any questions.
Sign in form.
Oh, yeah. You can sign in here.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Hey, sorry, I forgotten to look in my inbox for Outlook and just saw the link there. So thank you. If you send a little bit earlier, like when I'm in class, then I'm bound to get it. So if you,
sorry, we sent it a bit late.
Anyway, everything's going all right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah, sorry, we thought you were in the mailing list, but apparently you weren't. So we
Sorry, what was the
that.
question?
Yeah. We thought we were in the mailing list, but you weren't. So we just added you today. Sorry about that.
Yeah, and I saw something about tomorrow, and I don't know if you sent that out yesterday, but I was.
Yeah, we did.
I'm glad I checked to see if you guys were here. So yeah. Everything worked out, so that's good. So anyway, have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Defining the console, like specifically, what is it? I mean, how do we tackle this?
So it's basically it's just given the error at console is not defined, and then it's giving the lines of when it's saying console log the trial number, number tries, and plus your guess. And
can you share your screen?
Guess number at the end. Yeah, sure thing.
Permissions. Yeah, I got you. Share screen. Boom.
What happening? Oh,
okay. Jaden has a question.
Oh wait, I
Chat.
cannot share screen while someone else is sharing.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Jane, you don't have a class after this?
I do. In a second, but it's fine.
Okay. Console log.
Yeah, so right here.
tries.
This is a little bit inaccurate. So something about this line.
Console. You misspelled it.
Thank you.
Office hours also. We don't have class.
Cool. Thank you.
All right, run.
That's
You
my
try
bad.
running. Yeah. Try running. It should work.
Also.
Yeah, okay, that works.
Epic. All right. Cool.
Thanks.
It's office hours, right? Yeah. No.
Yeah,
no.
yeah. Should be fine.
Yeah. Okay.